for you today how to take Cornell Notes using the Poetic Forms and Structures page that I think that most of you looked at on Friday in Canvas. Today during the lesson, I want for you to mimic my process for taking notes. So by the end of the lesson, you should have a page of notes on Poetic Forms and Structures that is identical to mine. You're going to start by dividing your paper into 4 sections. The top section is going to be for your name, date, and title of the lesson. Then you're going to divide the next big chunk into 2. And on your left skinny column, you're going to write key terms or academic vocabulary. This is a great place to kind of hold terms that you want to come back and make sure you understand by the end of the lesson. You'll see me do that as I model today. And then in this large chunk, this is going to be where you write down the main body of your learning. You're going to write down definitions of those key terms, big ideas, patterns that you're noticing, processes. So if I model a process for you, this is a great place to take notes on that process so that you remember how to do that later. And then it's also a great place to do your practice activities. So in Canvas, when you see one of the little quick quiz guys, do your practice activities here. Then you have access to them later on when you want to recall that information or learning. And then in the bottom section, you're going to write a short summary of what you learned during the lesson. This does not need to be lengthy. It does not need to be in depth. Kind of short and sweet, right? Synthesize your learning. What are the takeaways from the lesson? What are those umbrella ideas in the lesson that you want to remember? Okay, let's get started. Poetic form. Immediately I'm going to stop because I'm guessing that if that's the title of the page, that is a key term that I want to come back and make sure that I can define by the end of the lesson. So I'm going to write it down. You're going to notice that I do not have the luxury like you of writing it on the line, so I'm going to have to do some moving. So you'll have to be patient with me a little bit. A poem's shape is the way its words and lines are laid out on the page. There are 2 main units in a poem, lines and stanzas. Okay, so I'm guessing that lines and stanzas are also key terms because they're bolded. So I'm going to write those down here. You'll notice that I'm leaving some space in between my key terms so that I can come back and define those later on. So at this point, I still am not sure what poetic form is. So I'm going to wait until I've gone through the lesson and then come back and see if I can define that at that point. Lines, though, I do have some information about. It told me that there are 2 main units in a poem, lines and stanzas. So I know that lines are a unit within a poem. I have a pretty good idea of what a line is in a poem. So I'm going to leave it with that definition, even though it's pretty short. And then I can come back and add more if I need to later on. Often in poetry, the lines are arranged in groups called stanzas. A stanza's role in a poem is like that of a paragraph in prose. Each stanza is a separate emotion or idea, but it contributes to the overall meaning of the poem. Okay, so I know now what a stanza is, and I learned some important information about the stanza. So let's get down the meaning first. So a stanza is a group of lines, like a paragraph. So I have my definition, but I also learned that each stanza has a separate emotion or idea, and I think that's probably important. So each stanza expresses a different emotion or idea, yet helps me understand the poem as a whole. So I'm guessing that as I read poetry, I'm going to want to look for how those stanzas are broken up and what are the ideas or the emotions that each stanza is communicating. So I have this funny chart, traditional and organic. So I'm guessing that those are going to be two key terms. I'm going to write those down. Okay, let's look at traditional. Traditional, the characteristics of traditional poem are that it follows fixed rules such as a specific number of lines. It has regular patterns of rhythm and or rhyme. So traditional poetry is all about rules. It has regular patterns of rhythm and rhyme. I'm great at spelling today. Okay, some examples of that are epic, odes, ballads, sonnets, haikus, limericks. I'm not sure that I need those examples yet, but maybe. Let's look at this example. Surgeons must be very careful when they take the knife. Underneath their fine incision stirs the culprit life, by Emily Dickinson. So immediately I can notice that that this poem has definitely a rhyme scheme. I can hear careful, knife, and life, right? I can feel the rhythm. Surgeons must be very careful. So it definitely has some rules. I also notice that Emily Dickinson is capitalizing all of her sentences. So I'm going to write down it also, a pattern that I'm noticing is that traditional poetry also follows grammatical rules. Okay, let's read about some organic poetry. The characteristics of organic poetry is that it does not follow established rules or form. It does not have regular patterns of rhythm and may not rhyme at all. Okay, so it could rhyme, but it doesn't have to rhyme. And then it may use unconventional spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So let's get some of those definitions written down. So organic poetry has no rules. It doesn't have to rhyme or follow spelling or grammar rules. Some of the examples are free verse or concrete poetry. I'm not sure what those are yet, so I'm not going to write it down. Let's look at the example. Wherever anything, so even the words are shoved together. Wherever anything more than believe, with a spin, leap, alive, we're alive. We're wonderful 1 times 1. From If Everything Happens That Can't Be Done by E.E. Cummings. Okay, so I notice in this example that the poet is not using any grammatical rules, right? He's not capitalizing his sentences, but he doesn't even spell things correctly. So we have that here. I think that's going to be important. The author, I'm noticing that the author gets to make a lot of choices. Or the poet. Okay, so I have some additional notes down here, or additional content down here, and I want to look at it at least. We may not find anything that we need to write down, but I'm going to look at it. So the first model that I found was the organic form. Poems written in free verse, like this one shown, do not adhere to regular pattern of rhythm and rhyme. So from Beware, do not read this poem. Poem by Ishmael Reed. The hunger of this poem is legendary. It has taken in many victims. Back off from this poem. It has drawn in your feet. Back off from this poem. It has drawn in your legs. Back off from this poem. Okay, so I can write down that an example of organic poem is free verse. And I noticed, something I noticed about this poem is that I feel like that when I'm reading an organic poem like this one, that I can hear a little bit more of the poet's voice because they're not using any rules or following any rules for grammar. I notice when it says your, back off from this poem, it has drawn in your feet, right? I can hear the poet's voice coming across. So I have no idea if that's important, but I'm noticing a pattern, right? So I'm going to write it down. Or even maybe his culture. Right now I'm writing in incomplete sentences, but in your notes you certainly do not have to write incomplete sentences. Let's look at my traditional form. For centuries, poets have written sonnets that explore everything from unrequited love to the mysteries of nature. There are several types of sonnets, but all of them have 14 lines and are written in a strict pattern of rhythm and rhyme. Traditional poetry sounds strict. Read this poem, which is a Petrarchan sonnet, to determine the characteristics of the particular form. Pretty Words, poem by Eleanor Wiley. Poets make pets of pretty, docile words. I love smooth words like golden enameled fish, which circle slowly with a silken swish, and tender ones like downy feathered birds, word shy and dappled, deep-eyed deer in herds. Come to my hand and playful if I wish, or purring softly at a silver dish. Blue Persian kittens fed on cream and curds. Okay, so I'm noticing that the poet is using a very strict pattern, but I'm also noticing that it sounds very smooth, and I wonder if all poems that are written in the same form, in like a sonnet, sound very similar, whether they have that same smooth quality to them. So I'm going to ask that question. I wonder if poems obviously need to move down organic. Let's move that down a ways. So you'll notice you may want to leave lots of space between your key terms. Okay, so I'm also noticing that an example, because now that I know what a sonnet is, I'm noticing that an example is a sonnet, and that this interesting word, Petrarchan sonnet, right? So I'm guessing that there are even specific rhyme schemes that poets use. You'll learn what a Petrarchan sonnet is later on. Okay, so I have some pretty good notes, right? I have an idea of what lines, stanzas, and the difference between traditional and organic poetry are. I want to come back now to the definition of poetic form. So I think that poetic form is, from what I'm learning, is up here we have like the shape of the words and lines, but I think it's more than that. I also think it's the way it's written and the rules it's following. So the shape of the poem, the rules it's following. Because I noticed down here that the forms were epic, ode, ballad, sonnet, haiku, limerick. I'm guessing that they all have the same rules. Okay, so now I want to synthesize my learning. So when I look back at what I learned that there are two main types of poetry, organic and traditional. These poems follow different rules. All poems are broken up into lines and stanzas. Okay, so I have a pretty good idea of form and structure now. And so as I continue, I can come back to these notes and I can look at what did I learn about traditional and organic when I'm looking at a traditional or organic poem. Okay, so you should now have a page of notes that looks very similar to mine. Remember that your notes, although yours are identical to mine today, I do want your notes to be your own. So as you're writing down, as you're taking your notes, I want for you to notice patterns. I want for you to pull out key terms that are going to be important to your learning. I want for you to ask questions that are questions that you're having throughout your learning process. Although I am requiring you to take notes, your learning is still your learning, and I want to be intentional about that in the blending and learning environment. Okay, have fun.